So I grew up hearing the legend that my mother's German Jewish family originated in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, via the Netherlands. And this was always a story that I wanted to find out the truth regarding. And um, I had dabbled in some research in the past, but it wasn't until about 4 years ago that I really jumped wholeheartedly into this question. So when I first started really digging up what I could on the internet and in archives elsewhere, I was doing so to figure out what the truth was with this story. But of course, there were a couple other reasons why I started digging. But first and foremost, I was curious whether I could find out the history of what happened with our family and whether we did, in fact, originate in Spain before heading later on to Germany, and then, of course, the United States after that. I think that there are many controversial aspects of the journey that I've taken. One of the reasons why I went on this journey of discovery was in order to obtain Spanish nationality and a passport, which ultimately I was successful in doing, but it definitely had its risks. It took 28 steps in about 28 months. So it was a long, tedious journey that involved a lot of persistence. Um, the whole process for a Jewish American person obtaining Spanish citizenship is fraught with a number of different obstacles. I think for Jews, there's this feeling that Spain was a brutal place in our history where we were chased out, we were robbed of our heritage, our religion, killed, made to convert or leave. I think for many people who tend to be Zionists, they would like for Jews to migrate to the land of Israel rather than back to Europe, as it were. I'm not sure that all Spanish people necessarily agree with this program of trying to encourage Jews to repatriate to their Sephardic homeland. And I would say that there are also plenty of Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, and others who find that it shouldn't just be Jews who are able to go back to Spain, that if you were Muslim or Arab and your ancestors lived on the Iberian Peninsula and then either intermarried with locals and stuck around or went back to North Africa, as would have been the case for the vast majority, that they would also somehow have the right to do the same thing that Jews now have been able to do for the last half decade, but which effectively has the window has basically closed for that now. This process was very much a bureaucratic labyrinth, 28 steps in 28 months, most of which involved paperwork, finding documents that proved a link to, on the one hand, Sephardic heritage, but then on the other hand, also a link to modern Spain. And so there were two tests that I had to take. One was a Spanish language test at the A2 level, which for the European Union means advanced beginner. It's decent level of Spanish, but it's not terribly hard. And then the second test was political sort of citizenship test. You could Americans, people who become Americans or naturalized here, have to take the same sort of thing to learn about American history and to demonstrate they understand the Constitution. So for Spain, it's similar questions about geography and the history of the government. And then certainly had to go back to the synagogue where I grew up going and get a letter from the rabbi there, as well as a letter from the rabbi at the synagogue, B'nai Jeshurun, that we go to in New York City. And there were plenty of other documents, mainly family history, genealogical records that we needed to prove our connection to the Iberian Peninsula. I'm very grateful that the Center for Jewish History and the Leo Beck Institute gave me a place where I could find ample resources for doing genealogical research. It was a great place to bounce questions off of the very insightful librarian J.D. Arden. And during my time in the computer lab there, and also in the microfiche room, I racked my brain to figure out some very archaic medieval German records from synagogue rolls and cemetery records and all sorts of very old writing in a language that I essentially don't know. And that was definitely a challenging period of research, but I think above all else, my experience there helped me focus my energies. And really, as I was going about this research, I delved into different countries of inquiry along the way. So when I was at Leo Beck, obviously, I was mostly looking into the German chapter of our heritage. And so I was working in conjunction with a genealogist actually who was in Michigan, and he had helped us find records on the Bala Beitim, the head of the households from our Konstam family. Our surname Konstam is Kohn as in Cohen, and then Stam is Stamm, German for base or root. And so literally that would translate into English as priestly tribe. And at the Institute, I found a number of records that um, we have a big red book of genealogical history in our family that was written by a fellow named uh, Karl Theodor Marx, Theo Marx. And there were some notes that he had kept, which were compiled, that the Institute had on hand that I was able to locate. And so Theo had put together this book, which included a lot of these oral stories that came out of my family, and also is a massive genealogical tome that compiles thousands of names and trees and data points for this larger Konstam family that now lives predominantly in the US, UK, also Netherlands, Australia, Germany, Israel, South America. And so there were some notes around his own research efforts, and I found those to be helpful. I got back in touch with his family, and some of them are actually now on the West Coast in the U.S. My mom had been in touch with them many years ago, and I think that Leo Beck also put me in touch. There's a genealogist affiliated with Leo Beck, Karen Franklin, and she happens to be my mom's sixth cousin, I believe. And so we had crossed paths at various points in time, but I had never, well, I won't say never. I believe I had actually seen her in person, but we met again. We became acquainted again a few years ago at the Center for Jewish History in the process of me looking for proof of our Spanish heritage. And it turned out that Karen's husband had officiated, had presided over the memorial service for my grandfather, Paul Konstam, and it's actually his family that we were looking into the Spanish Sephardic connection with. And then it turns out that she had actually been doing research for my other side, my paternal grandmother, her family, and so there were a couple different ways that I crossed paths with Karen, and she was definitely one of the early supporters of my inquiries. But as I said, it was sort of the German chapter that I was looking into, as far as Spain, and then also Italy and the Netherlands. I definitely had to consult with other resources, largely in Europe, in those specific countries. But Leo Beck was very useful for me to mobilize and get my resources together, and really confer with the staff there to figure out the strategy for going about the research, and digging up some key historical points. I would say the best part of this experience, in a way, for me, was the passport materializing. That's something that I didn't really believe ever could happen. I think in a turbulent political time for the United States, having a second passport, EU citizenship, is not the worst thing by any means. I would say at the same time that it was it was definitely a challenging process, and I had to go over to Spain to consult with a notary and get documents signed. And there were certainly some awkward moments there in terms of trying to prove our ancestry, but it certainly was validating in the sense that we were chased out from that land. And I don't exactly know definitively what percentage of my family, of my ancestral lines, came from there. I have one friend who's an Israeli American journalist, and he pointed out, "Oh, well, Ben, you only have 1/512th of your family that originated on the Iberian Peninsula at most." And so there were definitely some skeptics along the way who pointed out the various holes in our story, and certainly we don't know the entirety of the story yet. I still would love to do more research into this, assuming that I have the time and also the resources to do more of the research, potentially on the ground through our. My mom has a very distant cousin in Holland now, and she appears to be willing to jump in to help us facilitate some more of that work. There's one line of inquiry around the family coat of arms. We have this cone stamp symbol that involves what appears to be a pelican in her piety, and that's actually the term used for this symbol of the Portuguese Sephardic community in Amsterdam specifically. It was originally a Catholic symbol, but it turned out that this became the Sephardic symbol in that city for many hundreds of years. And if you go to Amsterdam now, you'll still find that symbol. And that symbol, in a slightly altered format, looks a bit more like a swan, but it is clearly a reference to the Sephardic community there. And that's something that I've discovered is part of my family. And so while there was some Facebook chatter around the article that I wrote about Spanish citizenship and the fact that I had obtained it, there were naysayers who were telling me that, our connection was fabricated in some way. But then there were others who said, no, definitively, this is a sign that your family did maintain this cultural connection to that community in Europe and in Amsterdam. And so there were certainly some people along the way who've expressed skepticism, but I think that ultimately we are able, with technology and with better research methods on the internet, and being able to communicate with genealogists who are on the ground in various places, that we will move towards getting more of the truth about our history. We will continue to find more facts and pieces of evidence. And then there's also the DNA genetic component, obviously, which I think will help as well. But I think yes, overall, this has been a tremendously positive and meaningful experience for me, as a Jewish American person who is very motivated to learn about the past, to understand more about who we are, the Jewish people as a whole, and to find that connectedness to different eras in our history, and to those different places where we have lived along the way, and to cultivate connections to contemporary people now in Spain who are clearly interested in reviving those connections with our people. I find that that is also an inspiring, uplifting, but also a challenging process of rehabilitating those roots that we had in the past that may have been severed, but that still stay with us on our journey through the Galut, through the diaspora, as we try to move into the future and find where we belong and where we can really call home.